Dr. Sarah Mitchell had seen everything in 15 years of emergency medicine: heart attacks, car crashes, overdoses. Nothing surprised her anymore, until tonight. The ambulance screamed into Northwestern Memorial at 11:47 p.m., paramedics shouting over the sirens about a possible head trauma, massive bleeding, patient unconscious. What they wheeled through those doors made Sarah's blood run cold. Margaret Henderson, 67, lay motionless on the gurney, her silver hair matted with blood. But it wasn't the blood that made the seasoned physician step back in shock. It was the gaping wound on her scalp, where something had torn free, something that had been growing there for years. "Jesus Christ," whispered Nurse Johnson, a 20-year veteran who'd seen her share of horrors. Inside the crater-like opening, metallic fragments caught the fluorescent lights, embedded deep in tissue that looked impossibly organized, almost purposeful. Sarah had never seen anything like it. What they found that night would change everything. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, life in Millbrook, Illinois moved at the gentle pace of a town where everyone knew their neighbors and Sunday dinners were sacred. Margaret Maggie Henderson sat in her rose garden, the same one her late husband Bobby had planted when they'd bought the house in 1978. The pink climbing roses he'd chosen because they matched her blush on their wedding day still bloomed each spring, a living reminder of 44 years of marriage cut short by lung cancer 3 years ago. At 67, Maggie remained the same woman who'd taught second grade for 35 years, patient, kind, with steel beneath her soft exterior. Her silver hair, once bobby-pinned into neat teacher buns, now fell in gentle waves that she carefully arranged each morning to hide the small lump that had appeared shortly after Bobby's funeral. It started as nothing more than a pea-sized bump, easily concealed. She'd convinced herself it was stress, grief manifesting physically the way Dr. Patricia Williams always warned it could. The Henderson family gathered every Sunday at Maggie's ranch house, a tradition Bobby had insisted upon and she'd maintained religiously. Her daughter, Jennifer, 42 and recently divorced, would arrive with 16-year-old Tommy and 14-year-old Emma, filling the quiet house with laughter and arguments about homework and teenage drama. Jenny worried constantly about her mother living alone, suggesting everything from senior communities to moving in together, suggestions Maggie politely but firmly declined. Tommy, all elbows and knees and Bobby's stubborn chin, was starting to ask questions about his grandfather's war service. Emma, gentle like Maggie but with her mother's sharp intelligence, noticed things others missed, like how grandmother winced when she brushed her hair, or how she'd started wearing hats to church even in summer. Dr. Patricia Williams had been the Henderson family physician for 20 years, delivering Emma, treating Bobby through his final illness, and watching Maggie navigate widowhood with the same quiet strength she'd shown through everything else. She'd noticed Maggie's increasing hat collection during appointments but hadn't pressed when Maggie deflected questions about headaches. Father Michael O'Connor, 60 and graying at the temples, had officiated the Henderson wedding, baptized Jenny, and buried Bobby with words that brought comfort to a grieving congregation. He'd watched Maggie's faith deepen through loss, her attendance at daily mass becoming as regular as sunrise. He noticed she always sat in the back pew now, something she'd never done before. The house itself held 45 years of memories. Bobby's reading chair by the window, his coffee mug still in the cabinet, family photos chronicling decades of Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations. In the attic, wrapped in tissue paper and hidden behind boxes of holiday decorations, lay Bobby's Purple Heart and military correspondence, documents Maggie had never found the courage to read. Something was growing beneath Maggie's carefully styled hair, something that pulsed gently when she lay still at night, keeping rhythm with her heartbeat like a second pulse. She told herself it was nothing, the way Bobby had dismissed his own headaches in those final months. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves when Tommy Henderson bounded through his grandmother's front door that Sunday afternoon, his varsity jacket slung over one shoulder and grass stains on his knees from morning football practice. Emma followed more quietly, her arms full of textbooks and the latest novel she'd been devouring, while Jenny juggled a covered dish and her purse, already calling out apologies for being late. "Grandma Maggie, something smells incredible." Tommy's voice boomed through the small ranch house as he headed straight for the kitchen, where the familiar sounds of Sunday dinner preparation had been a constant for as long as he could remember. The pot roast had been Bobby's favorite, and Maggie still made it exactly the way he'd liked it, fork tender with carrots and potatoes that melted in your mouth. Maggie stood at the stove, her back to the family, stirring gravy with the same wooden spoon she'd used for decades. She wore a navy blue dress that brought out her eyes and a silk scarf tied carefully around her head, a new addition to her Sunday wardrobe that she'd explained away as wanting to look more sophisticated. The lump had grown again, now roughly the size of a walnut, making it impossible to style her hair in a way that completely concealed it. "Wash your hands, young man," she said without turning around, the same instruction she'd given him since he was tall enough to reach the kitchen sink. "Emma, sweetheart, would you help me with the rolls? They're about ready to come out." Jenny set her green bean casserole on the counter and studied her mother with the practiced eye of someone who'd been worried for months. Maggie moved differently now, more carefully, as if sudden movements might trigger something painful. She'd noticed her mother touching her head unconsciously during their phone calls, and the collection of scarves and hats had multiplied dramatically. "Mom, are you feeling all right? You look tired." Jenny reached out to touch her mother's forehead, a gesture that would have been natural 6 months ago but now made Maggie stiffen slightly. "I'm fine, honey. Just the usual aches and pains of getting older." Maggie's voice carried the forced brightness that had become her default whenever anyone expressed concern. "Tommy, would you carve the roast? Your grandfather always said you had the steadiest hands in the family." The dining room table was set with the good china, the pattern of tiny blue flowers that had been a wedding gift from Bobby's mother. Maggie had polished the silver until it gleamed, and fresh roses from the garden, the last blooms before winter, sat in the crystal vase that only came out for special occasions. Every Sunday was a special occasion now, each gathering more precious because she knew how quickly everything could change. They sat in their usual spots, Maggie at the head where Bobby used to sit, Jenny to her right, the children across from each other where they could continue their ongoing debate about everything from music to politics. The blessing was brief, a habit that had intensified since Bobby's death, and then the comfortable chaos of family dinner began. Tommy reached for the mashed potatoes with the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old athlete, while Emma carefully arranged her food in separate sections on her plate, a quirk she'd had since childhood. Jenny served everyone the green bean casserole, trying not to notice how her mother pushed food around her plate more than she actually ate it. "Grandma, Mrs. Patterson at school said you taught her when she was little," Emma said, looking up from her carefully constructed bite of pot roast and vegetables. "She said you were the nicest teacher she ever had and that you always remembered everyone's birthday." Maggie's face softened the way it always did when former students came up in conversation. 35 years of second graders had left her with a mental catalog of thousands of children, their faces and personalities still vivid even decades later. Patricia Patterson was Patricia Morris then, and she was one of my sweetest students. Always helped the other children with their reading. "She said you kept a jar of peppermints on your desk," Tommy added, grinning, "and that you never ran out no matter how many kids needed one." "A teacher's secret," Maggie laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. "Always be prepared for tears, scraped knees, and the occasional case of homesickness. Peppermints cure all three." The conversation flowed as it always did, covering school and work and town gossip, the comfortable rhythm of family who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Jenny talked about her new job at the insurance office. Tommy described his latest football game in detail that would have bored anyone but family, and Emma shared her thoughts on the novel she was reading for English class. It was when Tommy was reaching for his third helping of mashed potatoes, gesturing enthusiastically about a particularly impressive tackle, that everything changed. His elbow caught the edge of his water glass, sending it toppling toward the center of the table. Maggie instinctively leaned forward to catch it, and Tommy, trying to help, pushed back his chair and stood quickly. The collision was minor, Tommy's shoulder bumping into Maggie as she leaned forward, both of them reaching for the same falling glass. But the impact, gentle as it was enough to shift Maggie's carefully positioned scarf. The silk slipped backward, exposing not just the lump they'd all suspected was there, but something far worse. The growth had nearly tripled in size, a grotesque bulge that distorted the shape of Maggie's skull. The skin stretched over it was thin and discolored, with what looked like dark veins spreading outward like the roots of some terrible plant. It pulsed visibly, keeping time with her heartbeat in a way that made Jenny's stomach lurch. Emma's fork clattered to her plate, and she made a small, choked sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Tommy froze with his hand still extended toward the fallen glass, his face going pale as he stared at his grandmother's head. Jenny felt the blood drain from her face as the full scope of what her mother had been hiding became clear. "Mom." The word came out as barely a whisper, heavy with shock and growing horror. "Oh my God, Mom, what is that?" Maggie's hands flew to her head, trying to readjust the scarf, but it was too late. The secret she'd been guarding for months was out, and there was no taking it back. Her face crumpled with a mixture of embarrassment and fear, the careful composure she'd maintained for so long finally cracking. "It's nothing," she said, but her voice shook, and the words carried no conviction. "Just a little bump. It's not—" "That's not a little bump." Jenny was on her feet, moving around the table toward her mother. "Mom, that thing is huge. How long has it been like this? How long have you been hiding this from us?" Tommy had recovered enough to right his chair and kneel beside his grandmother, his young face serious in a way that made him look, suddenly, older. "Grandma, does it hurt? Why didn't you tell us?" Emma had started to cry quietly, the kind of tears that come when something feels fundamentally wrong with the world. Is Grandma going to die like Grandpa did? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, voicing the fear that had been growing in all their minds. Maggie reached out to touch Emma's face, her hand trembling slightly. "Oh, sweetheart, no, I'm not going anywhere. It's just something that happens sometimes when people get older. The doctor says—" "What doctor?" Jenny's voice was sharp now, the fear transforming into anger. "When did you see a doctor? What did they say?" Maggie's silence was answer enough. Jenny sank into the chair beside her mother, reaching out to examine the growth more closely. Up close, it was even more disturbing. The skin stretched so thin it was almost translucent, revealing dark shapes underneath that might have been blood vessels or something else entirely. "You haven't seen anyone, have you?" Jenny's voice was quiet now, deadly calm in the way that meant she was angrier than shouting would have indicated. "You've been walking around with this thing growing on your head and you haven't told a soul." "I didn't want to worry anyone," Maggie said, her voice small. "And I hoped it would just go away on its own." "Things like this don't go away on their own, Mom." Jenny stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. "Jesus Christ, this could be anything. Cancer, a tumor, an infection. You could be dying, and we'd never know because you're too stubborn to see a doctor." Tommy was still kneeling beside his grandmother's chair, his hand resting gently on her arm. "Grandma, we just want to help. We love you." "I know you do, sweetheart." Maggie's voice broke slightly. I've already lost your grandfather. I couldn't bear the thought of putting you all through that again." The admission hung heavy in the room, finally giving voice to the fear that had been driving her silence. Emma wiped her eyes and moved to stand behind her grandmother's chair, wrapping her arms around Maggie's shoulders in a fierce hug. "But hiding it won't make it go away," Emma said with the clarity that sometimes comes from the mouths of teenagers. "And if something happens to you, and we can't help because we don't know, that would be worse than anything." Jenny turned from the window, her face set with determination. "You're seeing Dr. Williams tomorrow morning. I don't care if I have to drag you there myself." "Jenny." "No, Mom. No arguments, no delays, no excuses. Tomorrow morning, first thing, and if Dr. Williams can't see you, we're going to the emergency room." Maggie looked around the table at her family, at Tommy's worried face, at Emma's tear-stained cheeks, at Jenny's fierce protectiveness, and felt the walls she'd built around her secret finally crumble. The thing on her head pulsed gently, a reminder that whatever was happening to her was beyond her control and growing worse by the day. "All right," she said quietly. "Tomorrow morning." The remainder of dinner passed in subdued conversation, the easy comfort of their Sunday tradition replaced by an undercurrent of worry that no one quite knew how to address. The pot roast sat largely uneaten, and the usual second helpings were forgotten as everyone struggled to process what they'd seen. Dr. Patricia Williams had delivered difficult news before, but she'd never had to tell a patient that their condition defied everything she'd learned in 30 years of medicine. She sat across from Maggie Henderson in her small examination room, the CT scan images clipped to the light board casting eerie shadows across the sterile white walls. Jenny gripped her mother's hand while Tommy and Emma waited anxiously in the lobby, their faces pressed against the glass partition that separated the waiting area from the examination rooms. "Maggie, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dr. Williams began, her voice measured but carrying an undertone of concern that made Jenny's stomach clench. "What we're seeing here isn't typical of any growth pattern I'm familiar with. The mass appears to have both organic and unusual metallic components integrated within the tissue structure." Maggie's face had gone pale when Dr. Williams first examined the growth, her practiced hands probing gently while her expression grew increasingly troubled. The physician had ordered immediate imaging, expediting tests that normally took weeks to schedule. The results had come back within hours, marked urgent and accompanied by a note from the radiologist requesting immediate consultation. "What does that mean?" Jenny asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Metallic components? How is that possible?" Dr. Williams pulled the first scan from the light board, pointing to areas where dark shadows seemed to weave through lighter tissue like threads through fabric. "These areas here show density consistent with metal fragments, but they're not showing up as foreign objects. They appear to be integrated somehow, as if they've become part of the tissue itself." Maggie stared at the images of her own skull, seeing the grotesque shape that had been hidden beneath her carefully styled hair. The growth looked like a twisted flower made of bone and shadow, its tendrils reaching deep into areas that made Dr. Williams frown with professional concern. "I've contacted Dr. Michael Chen at Northwestern Memorial," Dr. Williams continued. "He's one of the best neurosurgeons in the Midwest, and he's agreed to see you this afternoon. Maggie, I won't lie to you. This requires immediate attention from specialists with equipment I don't have access to here." The drive to Northwestern Memorial passed in silence, broken only by Emma's occasional sniffles from the back seat. Tommy sat rigid beside his sister, his usual teenage bravado replaced by a gravity that made him seem older than his 16 years. Jenny drove with white knuckles, her mind racing through possibilities she didn't want to consider, while Maggie sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the familiar suburbs giving way to the urban skyline of Chicago. Dr. Michael Chen met them in his office rather than an examination room, a detail that immediately struck Jenny as ominous. The neurosurgeon was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 50, with graying temples and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd delivered devastating news more times than anyone should have to. His office walls were lined with degrees and commendations, but also with photographs of patients who'd recovered from seemingly impossible conditions. "Mrs. Henderson, I've reviewed your scans with my colleagues and I need to be honest with you," Dr. Chen began after introductions were made and everyone had found seats in the comfortable chairs arranged around his desk. "In 25 years of neurosurgery, I've never seen anything quite like this. The growth pattern suggests something that's been developing slowly over a very long period, possibly years, but with characteristics that don't match any known pathology." He pulled up digital images on his computer screen, rotating three-dimensional models of Maggie's skull that made the full scope of the growth visible from every angle. The thing looked like it had roots, spreading tendrils that followed the natural curves of her skull and seemed to wrap around critical areas near the brainstem. "The metallic components are the most puzzling aspect," Dr. Chen continued. "They appear to be some kind of alloy that's not showing up on our standard metal detection protocols. More concerning is that they seem to be facilitating the growth rather than impeding it. The tissue around these metal areas is actually healthier and more organized than normal cellular structure." Jenny felt the room spin slightly. "Are you saying something was put in her head? Like, deliberately?" "I'm saying the integration is too precise to be accidental," Dr. Chen replied carefully. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you some questions that might seem unusual. Have you ever been involved in any kind of experimental medical treatment, military service, industrial accidents involving unusual materials?" Maggie shook her head slowly. "No, nothing like that. I taught second grade for 35 years. The most dangerous thing I ever encountered was playground equipment and the occasional parent-teacher conference." "What about your husband? Dr. Williams mentioned he passed away recently. Did he ever mention anything about unusual medical treatments, particularly military-related?" The question hit Maggie like a physical blow. Bobby's final months had been filled with strange episodes, moments when he seemed to be somewhere else entirely, conversations with people who weren't there, knowledge of things he'd never experienced. She'd attributed it all to the cancer, to medications, and the brain's response to pain and fear. "He was in Korea," she said slowly, 1950 to 1953, but he never talked about it much, said some things were better left buried. Dr. Chen exchanged a look with his resident, a young woman who'd been taking notes throughout the consultation. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to make some calls to colleagues who specialize in unusual cases. There was a program. It's classified material, but there have been whispers in the medical community about experimental treatments conducted on military personnel in the 1950s. Treatments that were discontinued and the records sealed." The weight of implication settled over the room like a thick blanket. Jenny's mind raced through memories of her father's final months, the way he'd sometimes call her by her mother's name, the strange headaches he'd complained about that seemed to come and go without any medical explanation. "You think my father was experimented on?" Jenny's voice was barely above a whisper. "And that somehow affected my mother?" "I think," Dr. Chen said carefully, "that we need to explore every possibility. Mrs. Henderson, I'd like to admit you for observation and more extensive testing. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we can determine the best course of treatment." Tommy spoke up for the first time since they'd arrived. "Is my grandma going to be okay?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating in its directness. Dr. Chen leaned forward, his professional demeanor softening slightly as he addressed the teenager whose world was crumbling around him. Your grandmother is stronger than she knows, he said. And we're going to do everything possible to help her. But I won't lie to you. This is uncharted territory. We're going to need time to understand what we're dealing with. The admission process took hours, forms and questionnaires and more tests than Maggie had undergone in her entire life combined. They drew blood, took tissue samples, and conducted neurological examinations that left her exhausted and shaken. Each new procedure revealed more questions than answers, and the medical team's growing concern became increasingly difficult to hide. Jenny called in favors to take time off work, arranging for extended leave that she prayed wouldn't become permanent. Tommy and Emma were excused from school, neither teenager able to concentrate on anything beyond their grandmother's condition. Father O'Connor drove down from Millbrook when Jenny called, arriving with prayers and homemade cookies from the church ladies who'd heard about Maggie's situation through the mysterious network of small-town communication. The hospital room became a makeshift family gathering place with flowers and cards from Maggie's former students covering every available surface. News of the beloved teacher's illness had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and the outpouring of support was both touching and overwhelming. Dr. Williams drove down each evening after her regular office hours, checking on Maggie and conferring with Dr. Chen about the increasingly puzzling test results. The tissue samples are unlike anything our pathologists have seen, Dr. Chen explained during one of his evening rounds. The cells appear to be normal human tissue, but they're organized in patterns that suggest intelligence, as if something is directing their growth and development. Maggie lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Jenny had ever seen her. The growth on her head was clearly visible now, no longer hidden beneath scarves and carefully styled hair. It pulsed gently but visibly, keeping time with her heartbeat in a way that mesmerized and horrified anyone who looked at it for too long. "Dr. Chen," Maggie said during one of his visits, her voice weak but determined. "I need to know what's happening to me. Not the medical terminology, not the careful phrases you use to spare my feelings. I need the truth." The neurosurgeon sat down in the chair beside her bed, abandoning the professional distance he usually maintained. "Mrs. Henderson, honestly, we don't know. The growth appears to be some kind of biological-mechanical hybrid that shouldn't be possible with current medical knowledge. It's not cancer, it's not an infection, and it's not any kind of natural growth pattern we've documented. If I had to guess, and at this point that's all any of us can do, I'd say something was introduced into your system years ago, something designed to remain dormant until triggered by specific conditions." "Like my husband's death," Maggie said, and it wasn't a question. "Possibly. Grief can trigger significant physiological changes. If there was some kind of dormant element in your system, extreme emotional stress could theoretically activate it." Jenny leaned forward from her chair on the other side of the bed. "But that means someone put something in her, deliberately, years ago." Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "The precision of the integration suggests it wasn't accidental. Mrs. Henderson, I've been in contact with some colleagues who work with declassified military medical records. There were programs in the 1950s and early 1960s, experiments conducted on military personnel without their knowledge or consent. Most of the records were destroyed, but there are references to something called Project Regeneration, attempts to develop medical technology that could save critically wounded soldiers." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the distant sounds of hospital activity in the corridor. Maggie closed her eyes, and for a moment, Jenny thought she'd fallen asleep. Then her mother spoke, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of decades-old secrets. "Bobby used to have nightmares, not about combat, about doctors, about being held down while they put something in his head. He said they told him it was to save his life, that he'd been critically wounded and this was experimental treatment. He thought they were just bad dreams brought on by trauma. The pieces of a terrible puzzle began falling into place, creating a picture that none of them wanted to see clearly. Tommy and Emma sat in stunned silence, trying to process the idea that their grandfather had been the subject of illegal medical experiments and that their grandmother was now paying the price for something that had happened before their parents were even born. Dr. Chen made more phone calls that night than he had in months, reaching out to contacts in military medicine, researchers who specialized in medical ethics violations, and colleagues who might have encountered similar cases. The responses he received were uniformly disturbing, whispered confirmations of programs that officially never existed, veiled warnings about government interest in unusual cases, and suggestions that some secrets were better left undisturbed. As Maggie slept fitfully in her hospital bed, surrounded by the family who loved her and the medical team who were struggling to help her, the growth on her head continued its steady, purposeful expansion. Whatever was happening to her was accelerating, and time was running out to find answers before the thing growing beneath her skin reached a critical mass that even the best medical minds in the country might not be able to address. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning when Dr. Chen received a phone call that changed everything. Colonel Patricia Hayes, a retired military physician now working as a civilian consultant, had heard about Maggie's case through channels that Dr. Chen didn't fully understand and didn't want to probe too deeply. What mattered was that Colonel Hayes claimed to have treated similar cases during her military career, cases that had been classified for over 60 years. Dr. Chen, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you could have serious consequences for both of us, Colonel Hayes said during their secure phone conversation. But that woman's life is at stake, and I've carried this burden long enough. The story that emerged was more disturbing than anything Dr. Chen had imagined. Between 1951 and 1954, a classified program called Project Regeneration had conducted experimental treatments on critically wounded Korean War veterans. The goal was to develop technology that could repair severe brain trauma and neurological damage that would otherwise be fatal or permanently disabling. Soldiers who volunteered for the program, or in some cases were volunteered by superior officers, underwent procedures that were decades ahead of their time. The treatment involved introducing what we called neural scaffolding into damaged brain tissue, Colonel Hayes explained. Microscopic frameworks that would guide cellular regeneration and essentially rebuild damaged neurological pathways. It worked, Dr. Chen. We saved lives that would have been lost, but there were unexpected consequences. The consequences, as Colonel Hayes detailed them, included delayed activation events that could occur years or even decades after the initial treatment. In rare cases, usually triggered by extreme emotional stress, the neural scaffolding would begin creating new tissue structures. Most patients died within months of activation. A few survived, but with severe neurological impairment. None of the cases had ever been documented in medical literature due to the classified nature of the program. Dr. Chen felt his blood run cold as the implications became clear. Are you telling me that Mrs. Henderson is experiencing a delayed reaction to a medical procedure that was performed on her husband over 60 years ago? That's exactly what I'm telling you. The neural scaffolding was designed to be biocompatible and to integrate with the host's cellular structure. In some cases, it became so integrated that it could be transmitted through close physical contact. Spouses were particularly susceptible due to the intimate nature of their relationship and prolonged exposure. The medical ethics violation was staggering in its scope. Hundreds of soldiers had been subjects in experiments they never consented to, and now their families were paying the price decades later. Dr. Chen thought about Bobby Henderson, dead for 3 years, and his widow lying in a hospital bed with something growing in her head that shouldn't exist according to any known medical science. Colonel Hayes, do you have treatment protocols? Any documentation about how to address these delayed activations? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Dr. Chen wondered if the connection had been lost. When Colonel Hayes finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of regret and professional guilt. Dr. Chen, I need you to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you could save Mrs. Henderson's life, but it could also destroy mine. Are you prepared for that responsibility? The protocols that Colonel Hayes provided were unlike anything in conventional medical practice. The neural scaffolding couldn't be removed through traditional surgery. It had become too integrated with Maggie's brain tissue. But it could potentially be deactivated through a combination of specific electromagnetic frequencies and targeted pharmaceutical intervention. The procedure was experimental, dangerous, and had never been successfully completed on a patient who had survived long enough for the attempt. Dr. Chen called an emergency consultation with his department head, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a woman whose reputation for discretion was matched only by her willingness to take on impossible cases. When he explained the situation, including the classified nature of Maggie's condition and the potential consequences of treating her, Dr. Warren listened without interruption before asking a single question. What are Mrs. Henderson's chances without intervention? 0, Dr. Chen replied without hesitation. The growth is accelerating. At the current rate of expansion, it will reach critical brain structures within 2 weeks. She'll die, and there's nothing conventional medicine can do to prevent it. Dr. Warren stared out her office window at the Chicago skyline for several long minutes before responding. Then we don't really have a choice, do we? Prep the surgical suite and assemble your best team. And, Dr. Chen, this conversation never happened. Breaking the news to Maggie and her family was one of the most difficult conversations Dr. Chen had ever had. Jenny's reaction was predictable. Rage at the government, at the military, at everyone who had conspired to create this situation. Tommy and Emma sat in stunned silence, trying to process the idea that their grandfather had been an unwitting test subject and that their grandmother was now suffering the consequences. But it was Maggie's response that surprised everyone. After Dr. Chen finished explaining the situation and the proposed treatment, she sat quietly for several minutes, her hand absently touching the growth on her head. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady. So, Bobby never knew what they did to him? No, Mrs. Henderson. The program was designed to be covert. Patients were told they were receiving advanced medical care for their injuries, which was technically true. They just weren't told about the experimental nature of the treatment or the potential long-term consequences. Maggie nodded slowly. He used to have dreams about being in a laboratory, men in white coats holding him down while they put something in his head. He thought they were nightmares brought on by combat stress. I used to hold him when he woke up screaming about doctors and metal spiders crawling in his brain. The room fell silent. Emma began crying quietly, and Tommy moved to sit beside his grandmother's bed, taking her hand in both of his. Jenny stood at the window, her back to the room, struggling to maintain her composure. What are the risks of this procedure? Jenny asked without turning around. Dr. Chen had been dreading this question. The success rate for similar procedures based on the limited historical data available is approximately 40%. Of the patients who survived, roughly half experienced significant neurological impairment. Mrs. Henderson could lose memory, motor function, or cognitive ability. There's also a 20% chance that the procedure itself could be fatal. And if we do nothing? She dies within 2 weeks, possibly sooner. Tommy spoke up from beside his grandmother's bed. Grandma, what do you want to do? Maggie looked around the room at her family, at Jenny's rigid posture that barely concealed her fear, at Emma's tear-stained face, at Tommy's earnest expression that reminded her so much of Bobby at that age. Then she thought about her husband, about the nightmares he'd endured and the secrets he'd carried, and about the life they'd built together despite forces they'd never fully understood. "I want to fight," she said firmly. "Bobby never got the chance to know what they did to him or to make a choice about it. I do, and I choose to fight." The next several days passed in a blur of preparation and increasingly complex medical discussions. Dr. Chen assembled a team of specialists who agreed to participate in the experimental procedure, each signing extensive waivers and confidentiality agreements. Colonel Hayes arrived in Chicago under the cover of a routine medical consultation, bringing with her boxes of declassified documents and equipment that officially didn't exist. The story began to leak despite everyone's best efforts to maintain secrecy. A nurse mentioned the unusual case to her husband, who worked for a local television station. A laboratory technician recognized the historical significance of the blood work results and contacted a medical journal. Within 48 hours, reporters were camping outside Northwestern Memorial, and Maggie Henderson's room was under unofficial security protection. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. Other families began coming forward with similar stories: veterans who had suffered from unexplained neurological symptoms, spouses who had developed mysterious growths years after their husbands' deaths, children who had been born with unusual medical conditions that defied explanation. The scope of Project Regeneration began to emerge, painting a picture of systematic human experimentation that had affected hundreds of families across multiple generations. Jenny found herself thrust into the role of family spokesperson, fielding calls from reporters, veterans advocacy groups, and government officials who alternately denied knowledge of the program and offered assistance that came with strings attached. The attention was overwhelming and frightening, but it also brought support from unexpected sources. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a bioethicist from Johns Hopkins, arrived unannounced with offers of legal assistance and connections to advocacy groups that specialized in government accountability. A team of investigative journalists from the Washington Post began digging into the historical records, uncovering evidence of cover-ups and destroyed documentation that painted an even more disturbing picture of the program's scope. Father O'Connor drove down from Millbrook every day, providing spiritual support and serving as a buffer between the family and the growing media circus. His presence was a calming influence on everyone, but particularly on Maggie, who found strength in his quiet faith and unwavering support. "God doesn't give us more than we can handle," he told her during one of his visits. "But sometimes He requires us to be stronger than we ever thought possible." As the date for the experimental procedure approached, Maggie's condition continued to deteriorate. The growth had expanded significantly, causing severe headaches and occasional episodes of disorientation that terrified her family. Dr. Chen monitored her condition hourly, adjusting medications and treatment protocols as her symptoms evolved. The night before the surgery, Maggie asked to speak privately with each member of her family. She gave Jenny her grandmother's wedding ring and the deed to the house, along with instructions about which of Bobby's belongings should go to which grandchildren. She told Tommy stories about his grandfather's youth and made him promise to finish high school and go to college. She held Emma while the teenager cried, whispering reassurances about love that transcends physical presence and family bonds that can't be broken by death or distance. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she told them all as they gathered around her bed for what might be their final time together as a complete family, "I want you to know that every day I've spent with you has been a gift. Bobby and I were blessed with a family that made every sacrifice worthwhile, every challenge bearable. That doesn't change, no matter what happens." The surgical team worked through the night, preparing equipment and reviewing procedures that existed only in classified documents and the memories of a handful of aging military physicians. Dr. Chen found himself questioning every decision, knowing that Maggie's life hung in the balance of experimental techniques that had never been successfully completed. As dawn broke over Chicago, Maggie Henderson was wheeled into surgery, surrounded by prayers, love, and the hopes of a family that had already lost too much. The growth on her head pulsed steadily, keeping time with her heartbeat like a countdown to an uncertain future. The surgery began at 6 a.m. on a cold November morning, with Dr. Chen leading a team of 8 specialists in what would become the most complex neurosurgical procedure ever attempted at Northwestern Memorial. The operating room had been reconfigured with equipment borrowed from military medical facilities, devices that officially didn't exist and carried no manufacturer's markings. Colonel Hayes stood beside the surgical table, her weathered hands steady as she guided the team through procedures she'd helped develop 60 years earlier. Jenny, Tommy, and Emma waited in the family conference room, surrounded by Father O'Connor, Dr. Williams, and a growing number of supporters who had driven down from Millbrook. The waiting room had become an impromptu command center, with television crews broadcasting live updates and government officials monitoring the situation from unmarked vehicles in the hospital parking garage. The surgery was being filmed for medical documentation, creating a permanent record of procedures that had been classified since the Eisenhower administration. 4 hours into the operation, complications began to emerge. The neural scaffolding had integrated with Maggie's brain tissue far more extensively than anyone had anticipated, creating a web of connections that made traditional surgical removal impossible. Dr. Chen found himself navigating through tissue that looked normal but behaved unlike anything in medical literature, pulsing with its own rhythm and responding to stimuli in ways that defied explanation. "Her brain activity is spiking beyond normal parameters," announced Dr. Sarah Martinez, the neurologist monitoring Maggie's responses throughout the procedure. "Whatever this scaffolding is doing, it's not just passive tissue. It's actively communicating with her nervous system." Colonel Hayes leaned over the surgical table, examining the exposed growth with instruments that resembled medical equipment, but incorporated technologies that wouldn't be developed by civilian medicine for decades. The neural scaffolding was visible now, a delicate tracery of what appeared to be metallic threads woven through living tissue in patterns too complex and purposeful to be natural. "The original design was self-modifying," she explained to the surgical team. "It was meant to adapt to each patient's specific neurological structure. But in Mrs. Henderson's case, it appears to have been adapting for over 60 years, creating connections and pathways that were never part of the original specification." 5 hours in, Maggie's vital signs began to fluctuate wildly. Her heart rate spiked to dangerous levels, then dropped to barely detectable, while her brain activity showed patterns that Dr. Martinez had never seen in 3 decades of neurology. The monitors displayed readings that seemed to indicate multiple consciousness states existing simultaneously, as if different parts of her brain were operating independently. "We're losing her," Dr. Chen announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Blood pressure is dropping, and her neural activity is becoming chaotic. We need to make a decision. Continue the extraction or abort, and try to stabilize her." Colonel Hayes made the call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Continue. If we stop now, the scaffolding will resume its growth pattern and she'll die anyway. This is her only chance." In the waiting room, Jenny felt her phone vibrate with a text from Dr. Chen's surgical nurse. "Complications. Critical phase. Pray." She shared the message with Father O'Connor, who immediately began leading the gathered crowd in prayer, their voices joining together in a chorus of desperate hope that echoed through the hospital corridors. 6 hours into the surgery, something extraordinary happened. As Dr. Chen attempted to separate a particularly complex section of neural scaffolding from the brainstem, Maggie's eyes opened on the surgical table. She looked directly at him, her gaze clear and focused despite the ongoing procedure, and spoke in a voice that was recognizably hers but carried undertones that made everyone in the operating room pause. "Bobby's here," she said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. "He says to tell you that the blue threads connect to memory and the silver ones carry emotion. Don't cut the silver ones, or you'll lose who I am." The surgical team exchanged glances of stunned disbelief. Maggie should have been unconscious under general anesthesia, and the areas of her brain currently being operated on should have made coherent speech impossible. Yet here she was, providing guidance for her own surgery with information that no one in the room possessed. Dr. Chen followed her instructions, carefully avoiding the silver threads she'd mentioned while working around the blue ones. As he did so, Maggie continued to provide commentary from the surgical table, her voice remaining calm and steady despite the profound violation of everything they understood about consciousness and anesthesia. "He's sorry he never told me," she said at one point. "He was afraid I'd think less of him if I knew what they'd done. But I could never think less of him. He was the bravest man I ever knew, and what they did to him doesn't change that. 7 hours in, Doctor." Chen reached the core of the neural scaffolding, a structure that pulsed with its own internal light and seemed to generate its own electromagnetic field. As he prepared to remove it, Maggie's voice took on a different quality, deeper and more resonant, carrying an accent that Jenny would have recognized immediately. "Take care of my girls," the voice said, and it was unmistakably Bobby Henderson speaking through his wife's lips. "Tell them I never left. Tell them I've been here all along, watching over them, loving them. Tell them that what's about to happen isn't an ending. It's a beginning." Colonel Hayes stepped closer to the surgical table, her face pale with the recognition of something she'd theorized about but never witnessed. "The scaffolding isn't just integrated with her nervous system," she whispered. "It's been storing neural patterns, memories, possibly even consciousness itself." The extraction of the core scaffolding took another 2 hours, with Dr. Chen working with microscopic precision to separate decades of growth from critical brain structures. Each severed connection caused Maggie to convulse slightly, and her commentary became increasingly fragmented, shifting between her own voice and echoes of Bobby's personality. At 4:17 p.m., Dr. Chen successfully removed the last piece of neural scaffolding from Maggie's brain. The moment the final connection was severed, every monitor in the operating room went flat. No heartbeat, no brain activity, no vital signs of any kind. Maggie Henderson had died on the surgical table, her body finally free of the foreign technology that had been growing within her skull for years. The surgical team worked frantically for 47 minutes, employing every resuscitation technique available to modern medicine: electric shocks, cardiac massage, experimental drugs that existed only in research protocols. Nothing produced even the faintest sign of life. Dr. Chen finally called time of death at 5:04 p.m., his voice breaking as he made the announcement that would devastate a family and end one of the most extraordinary medical cases in modern history. In the waiting room, Jenny felt the moment of her mother's death like a physical blow, though no one had yet delivered the news. She doubled over in her chair, gasping for breath, as an overwhelming sense of loss washed over her. Tommy and Emma moved to their mother's side, their own faces reflecting the terrible knowledge that something fundamental had changed in their world. Father O'Connor was the first to see Dr. Chen approaching, his surgical scrubs stained with blood and his face carrying the weight of failure. The priest stood slowly, his own heart breaking as he prepared to offer comfort to a family that had already endured too much loss. "I'm sorry," Dr. Chen said, his professional composure finally cracking. We did everything we could, but the integration was too extensive. The scaffolding had become part of her neural structure, and removing it— I'm so very sorry for your loss. Jenny's scream of anguish echoed through the hospital corridors, a sound of pure grief that seemed to tear something fundamental in the fabric of the world. Tommy collapsed into a chair, his young face crumpling as the reality of losing his grandmother hit him with the force of a physical assault. Emma simply stared at Dr. Chen, her tears falling silently as she struggled to process a world without Maggie Henderson's gentle presence. The media circus outside the hospital erupted into chaos as news of Maggie's death spread. Reporters shouted questions about government accountability and medical ethics, while protesters demanded justice for the victims of Project Regeneration. Inside the hospital, a family mourned the loss of a woman who had been both victim and hero, a teacher who had touched hundreds of lives, and a grandmother whose love had sustained 3 generations. Colonel Hayes stood in the empty operating room long after the surgical team had departed, staring at the collection of neural scaffolding that had been removed from Maggie's brain. The technology represented decades of classified research and the culmination of scientific achievement that had cost too many lives. She made a decision that would define the remainder of her career. Every document related to Project Regeneration would be declassified, and every family affected would receive the truth they deserved. As night fell over Chicago, the Henderson family began the terrible process of planning another funeral, their grief compounded by the knowledge that Maggie's death was the result of experiments conducted before she was even born. The small ranch house in Millbrook stood empty, its rose garden dormant for the winter, waiting for a spring that would bloom without the woman who had tended it with such care. The growth that had killed Maggie Henderson lay in a laboratory container, a grotesque reminder of humanity's capacity for both scientific innovation and moral failure. But in the hearts of those who loved her, something else entirely was taking root, a determination to ensure that no other family would suffer the consequences of secrets buried too deep and truths hidden too long. The tragedy that had befallen the Henderson family was complete, but the story was far from over. The funeral home in Millbrook had never hosted a service quite like Maggie Henderson's. What should have been a simple memorial for a beloved retired teacher had become a media spectacle, with satellite trucks lining Main Street and reporters from national news networks interviewing anyone willing to talk about the woman whose death had exposed one of the most disturbing government cover-ups in American history. Jenny sat in the front pew of St. Mary's Catholic Church, flanked by Tommy and Emma, watching Father O'Connor struggle to deliver a eulogy that could somehow make sense of senseless tragedy. The church was packed beyond capacity, with mourners spilling into the vestibule and onto the front steps. Maggie's former students, now adults with children of their own, had driven from across the Midwest to pay their respects to the teacher who had shaped their lives. Veterans from 3 different wars sat together in solidarity, their faces grim with the knowledge that Maggie's death was connected to the same system that had sent them into harm's way. Government officials occupied a section near the back, their presence both unwelcome and necessary as the investigation into Project Regeneration continued to unfold. Maggie Henderson lived her life in service to others, Father O'Connor said, his voice carrying across the crowded sanctuary. She taught our children, loved her family with fierce devotion, and faced her final challenge with a courage that should inspire us all. But her death also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the institutions we trust and the price of secrets kept too long. Jenny barely heard the words. Her grief had evolved beyond tears into something harder and more focused, a burning anger that threatened to consume everything in its path. The woman who had raised her, who had been the anchor of their family for over 4 decades, was dead because of experiments conducted by men who had faced no consequences for their actions. Bobby's unwitting participation in Project Regeneration had cost him his peace of mind and ultimately his wife's life. A chain of causation that stretched across 60 years of government denials and classified documentation. After the service, the family gathered at the funeral home for a private viewing before the burial. The casket was closed at Jenny's request. The autopsy had been too extensive, and she wanted people to remember Maggie as she had lived, not as she had died. But as they stood around the flower-draped casket, Tommy noticed something that made his blood run cold. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at the flowers." Jenny followed her son's gaze to the elaborate arrangement of white roses that covered the casket. Mixed among the pristine blooms were darker flowers, roses that appeared to be made of metal, their petals catching the funeral home's subdued lighting in ways that natural flowers never could. The metallic roses were beautiful in their own way, but their presence was deeply unsettling, a reminder of the artificial elements that had grown within Maggie's brain. "Who sent these?" Emma asked, reaching out to touch one of the strange flowers before Jenny caught her hand. The funeral director, a nervous man named Peterson, who had been handling Millbrook funerals for 30 years, consulted his records with shaking hands. "There's no card," he admitted. "They were delivered this morning by a government vehicle. The driver said they were from colleagues who understood the sacrifice." The metallic roses became the subject of intense speculation among the gathered mourners. Some saw them as a touching tribute to Maggie's unique circumstances, while others viewed them as a callous reminder of the experiments that had killed her. Dr. Chen, who had driven down from Chicago for the funeral, examined the flowers with professional interest, noting that their construction bore similarities to the neural scaffolding that had been removed from Maggie's brain. "They're not threatening," he assured Jenny, "but they're also not purely decorative. The metallic composition is similar to the materials we found in your mother's neural tissue. Someone with access to classified technology made these specifically for this funeral." The burial at Millbrook Cemetery was attended by a smaller group of family and close friends, but even this intimate gathering was disrupted by the ongoing investigation into Project Regeneration. Federal agents photographed everyone in attendance, and helicopters circled overhead, their cameras recording the final moments of a woman whose death had become a matter of national security. Maggie was laid to rest beside Bobby's grave, their matching headstones now united in death as they had been in life. As the mourners dispersed, Jenny found herself alone at the gravesite with Colonel Hayes, the retired military physician whose revelations had made Maggie's surgery possible, but ultimately unsuccessful. The older woman stood silently for several minutes before speaking, her voice heavy with decades of accumulated guilt. "I need you to know that your mother's death wasn't meaningless," Colonel Hayes said. "The documentation we've recovered will help hundreds of other families understand what happened to their loved ones. The truth about Project Regeneration is finally coming to light, and that's partly because of her courage." Jenny's response was immediate and devastating. "My mother is dead because your people turned my father into an unwitting test subject. Don't you dare try to find meaning in that." The confrontation that followed was witnessed by several reporters who had lingered after the burial, their cameras capturing Jenny's raw grief and anger as she verbally attacked the woman she held responsible for her family's destruction. The footage would be broadcast on national television that evening, showing a daughter's pain in the face of government accountability that came too late to save the woman she loved most. 60 years, Jenny screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. You people had 60 years to come forward, to warn the families, to provide treatment before it was too late. But you kept your secrets, and now my mother is dead because of your cowardice. Colonel Hayes accepted the verbal assault without defending herself, understanding that Jenny's anger was justified. and that no apology could bridge the gulf between government necessity and personal loss. When Jenny finally exhausted herself, the older woman simply nodded and walked away, leaving behind a family destroyed by decisions made before they were born. The weeks following Maggie's funeral were marked by a series of devastating revelations as more Project Regeneration documents were declassified. The scope of the human experimentation was far broader than anyone had initially suspected, involving not just Korean War veterans, but also subjects from subsequent conflicts and even civilian populations near military installation. Families across the country began coming forward with stories of unexplained medical conditions, mysterious deaths, and symptoms that finally made sense in light of the emerging evidence. Jenny threw herself into the legal battles that followed, joining class action lawsuits against the Department of Defense and demanding congressional investigations into the cover-up. Tommy and Emma struggled to return to normal teenage life while their mother pursued justice with an intensity that worried everyone who loved her. The grief counselor recommended by Dr. Williams suggested that Jenny's focus on legal action was a form of denial, a way of avoiding the emotional work of mourning her mother's death. The media attention that had surrounded Maggie's case gradually shifted to other stories, but the impact of her death continued to reverberate through the medical and legal communities. New protocols were established for handling classified medical conditions, and legislation was introduced to prevent future human experimentation without informed consent. The metallic roses from her funeral were eventually analyzed by independent researchers who confirmed that they were constructed from the same materials used in the neural scaffolding, though no one could determine who had created them or why. 3 months after Maggie's death, Jenny received a package with no return address, delivered to her childhood home where she had been staying while sorting through her mother's belongings. Inside was a small metal box containing items that had belonged to Bobby during his military service: photographs, letters, and medical records that provided the final pieces of the Project Regeneration puzzle. The documents revealed that Bobby had volunteered for the experimental treatment after being told he would die without intervention. His injuries from a mortar explosion near Seoul had been far more severe than the family had ever known, and the neural scaffolding had indeed saved his life. But the records also showed that military physicians had known about the potential for delayed activation in family members, information that had been deliberately withheld from the subjects and their loved ones. Most devastating of all was a letter Bobby had written to Maggie shortly before his discharge, a letter that had never been sent. In it, he expressed his fears about what the military doctors had done to him and his hope that the experimental treatment wouldn't affect the family he planned to build with the woman he loved. The letter ended with a promise that he would protect her from the consequences of his military service, a promise that circumstances had made impossible to keep. Reading her father's words, written in his careful handwriting over 60 years earlier, Jenny finally understood the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen her family. Bobby had been both victim and hero, a young man who had volunteered for dangerous medical treatment to save his own life and return to the woman he loved. The fact that his sacrifice had ultimately cost Maggie her life was an irony too cruel to bear, a cosmic injustice that no amount of legal action could address. That night, Jenny sat in her mother's rose garden, surrounded by the dormant plants that would bloom again in spring, without the woman who had tended them for over 40 years. The metallic roses from the funeral had been placed among the natural flowers, their artificial beauty a permanent reminder of the technology that had destroyed her family. As she sat in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the bare branches, Jenny finally allowed herself to grieve not just for her mother's death, but for the life her family might have lived if the truth about Project Regeneration had been revealed decades earlier. The tragedy that had begun with a young soldier's decision to volunteer for experimental treatment had reached its devastating conclusion in a hospital operating room, leaving behind a family fractured by loss and a community struggling to understand how such injustices could occur in a democratic society. Maggie Henderson was dead, and no amount of government accountability or financial compensation could bring her back or heal the wounds her death had created. In the months that followed, Jenny would find purpose in advocacy work and legal battles. Tommy would channel his grief into academic achievement that would eventually lead him to medical school, and Emma would become a writer whose work explored themes of family, loss, and the price of secrets. But the immediate aftermath of Maggie's death was marked only by the terrible silence of a house where laughter had once echoed, and the empty chairs around a dining room table where Sunday dinners would never again bring the family together. The Henderson family's story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked government power and the importance of transparency in medical research. But for Jenny, Tommy, and Emma, it remained simply the story of how they lost the woman who had been the center of their world, a loss that would define the rest of their lives and serve as a permanent reminder that some wounds never fully heal. 6 months after Maggie Henderson's funeral, Jenny was organizing her mother's papers in the small den that had served as Bobby's study when an envelope fell from between the pages of an old photo album. The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed in Bobby's handwriting to "My Dearest Maggie," and marked with a date from 1953, the year he returned from Korea. Jenny's hands trembled as she realized this was correspondence her mother had never mentioned, letters that had been hidden for over 60 years. The first letter contained Bobby's detailed account of his final mission in Korea, written in the careful script of a young man trying to make sense of trauma that had no easy explanation. He described the mortar attack that had nearly killed him, the field hospital where military doctors had performed experimental surgery, and the weeks of recovery during which he'd experienced strange dreams and episodes of missing time. Most importantly, he wrote about the growing certainty that something had been done to him without his full understanding or consent. "They tell me I volunteered for the procedure," Bobby had written, "but I don't remember making that choice. I remember being told I would die without immediate intervention, and I remember signing papers I was too injured to read properly. Whatever they put in my head has changed something fundamental about who I am. I have memories that aren't mine, knowledge of things I never learned, and sometimes I feel like I'm sharing my thoughts with someone else." The second letter was even more disturbing. Bobby described experiencing episodes where he seemed to black out for hours at a time, only to wake up with no memory of what had transpired. During these episodes, nurses told him he had spoken in languages he didn't know and provided detailed medical information about other patients' conditions, despite having no medical training. The military physicians monitoring his case had been intensely interested in these incidents, conducting tests and interviews that Bobby found increasingly invasive and frightening. "I'm scared, Maggie," he had written, "not of dying. I face that possibility every day in combat. I'm scared of what I might become, of what they might have turned me into. But I'm more scared of never seeing you again, of never having the chance to build the life we planned together. So I'm going to keep their secrets, follow their rules, and pray that whatever they did to me doesn't spread to the people I love." Jenny found herself crying as she read her father's words, understanding for the first time the burden he had carried throughout his marriage to her mother. The man she remembered as strong and steady had been struggling with the consequences of medical experimentation for his entire adult life, hiding his fears and symptoms to protect the family he loved. The headaches, the nightmares, the occasional episodes of confusion that had marked his final years, all of it made terrible sense now. The third letter contained the most shocking revelation of all. Bobby had discovered, through careful observation and questioning of other patients, that the experimental treatment involved the introduction of what military doctors called biological enhancement material into brain tissue. The goal was to create soldiers who could survive catastrophic injuries and potentially transfer their knowledge and experience to other personnel. The implications were staggering. The military had been attempting to create a form of biological information storage and transfer using living human subjects. "They're trying to make us into something more than human," Bobby had written, "but I don't think they understand the cost." The other subjects I've talked to all report similar symptoms: shared memories, knowledge that isn't ours, voices in our heads that belong to other people. Some of them have started claiming they can communicate with deceased comrades. The doctors are fascinated, but they don't see what it's doing to our souls. The final letter was addressed not to Maggie but to any family members who might discover Bobby's correspondence after his death. In it, he provided detailed instructions for recognizing the symptoms of what he called delayed activation syndrome and urged his survivors to seek immediate medical attention if any family member began experiencing unexplained neurological symptoms. He had known somehow that the experimental treatment might affect his loved ones even after his death. "If you're reading this, it means the worst has happened," Bobby had written. The enhancement material was designed to be self-replicating and transmissible through close contact over extended periods. The military doctors warned us that spouses and children might be affected, but they assured us the risk was minimal. I pray they were right, but if they weren't, you need to know that everything that happens from this point forward is my fault. I made the choice to accept their treatment, and any consequences that follow are mine to bear. Jenny called Dr. Chen immediately, her voice shaking as she read portions of Bobby's letters over the phone. The neurosurgeon listened in stunned silence as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, providing explanations for aspects of Maggie's condition that had never made sense. The neural scaffolding hadn't been a malfunction or delayed reaction. It had been designed to activate under specific circumstances, transferring stored information and possibly even consciousness patterns to suitable hosts. "Mrs. Walsh," Dr. Chen said, using Jenny's married name, "these letters suggest that your mother's condition was not an accident or an unexpected side effect. The enhancement material was specifically designed to create what your father described, a form of biological data storage that could be transmitted between individuals. Your mother wasn't suffering from a medical anomaly. She was experiencing the intended function of technology that was never supposed to be used on human subjects." The revelation transformed everything about the Henderson family's understanding of what had happened to them. Maggie's death had not been the result of experimental treatment gone wrong. It had been the predictable outcome of a deliberate program designed to use human beings as biological computers. The government's apparent surprise at the delayed activation had been an act, a way of deflecting responsibility for consequences they had always known were possible. Jenny immediately contacted the attorneys handling the class action lawsuit against the Department of Defense, providing them with Bobby's letters as evidence of the military's knowledge and intent regarding the enhancement program. The documents proved that informed consent had been impossible because the subjects were never told the true nature of the experiments or their potential long-term consequences. More damning still, the letters revealed that military physicians had known about the risk to family members, but had chosen to proceed with the program anyway. The legal team's response was immediate and dramatic. The Bobby Henderson letters, as they came to be known in legal documents, provided the smoking gun that prosecutors had been seeking for months. Within days, federal investigators were executing search warrants at military installations across the country, seeking additional documentation about Project Regeneration and related programs. The Department of Defense's position shifted from denial to damage control as the scope of their liability became clear. Colonel Hayes, who had become an unofficial advocate for Project Regeneration victims, contacted Jenny directly after learning about the letters. The retired physician's voice was heavy with emotion as she confirmed the authenticity of Bobby's accounts and provided additional context about the enhancement program's true objectives. "Your father was right about everything," Colonel Hayes said during their phone conversation. The enhancement material was designed to create biological storage systems that could preserve and transfer human consciousness and memory. The goal was to develop soldiers who could never truly die. Their experiences and knowledge would live on in other personnel, creating an immortal military intelligence network. The ethical implications were staggering. The enhancement program had essentially treated human beings as experimental hardware for developing consciousness transfer technology, with no regard for the subject's autonomy or the welfare of their families. Bobby and hundreds of other veterans had been unwitting participants in research that challenged fundamental assumptions about human identity and the nature of consciousness itself. Jenny found herself at the center of a media storm as news of the Bobby Henderson letters spread. Television networks competed to interview the daughter of the soldier whose own words had exposed the true scope of government deception, while congressional committees demanded her testimony about the program's impact on military families. The attention was overwhelming, but Jenny embraced her role as spokesperson for the victims, determined to ensure that her parents' suffering would lead to meaningful accountability. The most difficult aspect of the revelations was understanding that Maggie had likely known more about her condition than she had ever admitted. Bobby's letters suggested that enhancement material recipients often experienced shared consciousness with their affected family members, meaning that Maggie might have been aware of Bobby's presence within her neural structure for years before her symptoms became visible. The growth on her head had been the physical manifestation of a biological process that had been occurring at the neurological level throughout the final years of her marriage. She knew, Jenny told Dr. Chen during one of their conversations about the medical implications of Bobby's revelations. When she was talking during the surgery, when she knew things she couldn't possibly know, that wasn't delirium or hallucination. That was my father, somehow preserved within the enhancement material trying to help us save her. Dr. Chen confirmed that the surgical team's observations were consistent with the consciousness preservation and transfer described in Bobby's letters. Maggie's ability to provide guidance during her own surgery, speaking in Bobby's voice and demonstrating knowledge she couldn't have possessed, suggested that the enhancement material had indeed created a form of shared consciousness between the husband and wife. The Henderson family's tragedy had revealed one of the most disturbing human experimentation programs in American history, but it had also exposed something even more profound about the nature of love and connection between human beings. Bobby Henderson had carried the burden of unwilling participation in consciousness transfer experiments for 60 years, and Maggie had shared that burden without fully understanding its nature. Their love story had become intertwined with cutting-edge neuroscience in ways that challenged everything society believed about death, memory, and human identity. As Jenny prepared to testify before Congress about her family's experience, she carried with her not just Bobby's letters, but also the knowledge that her parents' connection had transcended the boundaries of individual consciousness. The enhancement material that had ultimately killed her mother had also preserved something of her father that might otherwise have been lost forever. It was a revelation both terrifying and profound, suggesting that the strongest human bonds might survive even the most invasive technological interventions. The truth about Project Regeneration was finally emerging, but the Henderson family's story was far from over. The consequences of Bobby's decision to accept experimental treatment in 1953 were still unfolding, and Jenny was beginning to understand that her own children might also be affected by technology that had been designed to replicate across generations of military families. 2 years after Maggie Henderson's death, The small ranch house in Millbrook had been transformed into something neither she nor Bobby could have imagined. The living room where 3 generations of the family had gathered for Sunday dinners now served as a meeting space for support groups. The kitchen table where Maggie had graded papers and Bobby had read his morning coffee had become a workspace for legal documents and advocacy materials. Jenny had kept the house as a memorial to her parents and as headquarters for the Henderson Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families affected by classified military medical experiments. The Foundation's work had grown far beyond what Jenny had initially envisioned when she established it with the settlement money from the class action lawsuit against the Department of Defense. What had started as a simple victim support network had evolved into a comprehensive research and advocacy organization, providing medical monitoring for at-risk family members, legal assistance for ongoing cases, and educational resources about the long-term consequences of human experimentation. The metallic roses from Maggie's funeral had been preserved in a place of honor on the mantel, a reminder of the technology that had taken so much from so many families. Tommy, now 18 and preparing for his freshman year at Northwestern University, had chosen to study biomedical engineering with a focus on neuroethics. His decision had surprised everyone, including himself, but he explained that understanding the science behind what had happened to his grandparents was the only way he could make peace with their deaths. Emma, 16 and already showing the intellectual curiosity that had marked her grandmother's teaching career, spent her afternoons at the Foundation office, helping to catalog the hundreds of letters and testimonials that arrived from affected families across the country. The congressional hearings that had resulted from Bobby's letters had led to the most comprehensive investigation of military medical experimentation since the Nuremberg trials. Jenny's testimony, delivered with the same quiet strength that had characterized her mother's approach to teaching, had moved even the most hardened politicians to tears. The video of her reading portions of her father's letters to a packed hearing room had been viewed millions of times online, becoming a powerful symbol of the human cost of government secrecy. "My father was 19 years old when he volunteered for experimental treatment," Jenny had told the congressional committee. "He was dying from shrapnel wounds and was told that this procedure would save his life. He couldn't have known that accepting that treatment would eventually kill the woman he loved more than life itself. He couldn't have known that his decision would affect children and grandchildren who weren't even born yet. And he couldn't have known that the government he served would spend 60 years covering up the consequences of their experimentation." The fallout from the hearings had been swift and comprehensive. 3 cabinet-level officials had resigned, dozens of military officers had been court-martialed for their roles in the cover-up, and Congress had passed the Henderson Act, legislation that prohibited classified medical experimentation on military personnel without full informed consent and independent oversight. The law also established a compensation fund for affected families and required the declassification of all remaining documents related to human experimentation programs dating back to World War II. Dr. Chen had become one of the Foundation's most important medical advisors, providing pro bono consultations for families dealing with unusual neurological conditions that might be related to historical experimentation. His work with Maggie had established him as one of the world's leading experts on the long-term consequences of neural enhancement technology, and he had published extensively about the ethical implications of consciousness transfer research. The surgical techniques developed during Maggie's operation had been refined and were now being used to help other victims of similar experimentation. Colonel Hayes had also joined the Foundation's board of directors, dedicating her retirement years to making amends for her role in Project Regeneration. Her insider knowledge of military medical programs had proven invaluable in helping families navigate the complex bureaucracy involved in obtaining treatment and compensation. Despite the animosity Jenny had initially felt toward her, The two women had developed a working relationship based on their shared commitment to ensuring that the truth about military experimentation would never again be buried. "I can't undo what we did," Colonel Hayes had told Jenny during one of their early meetings. "But I can spend whatever time I have left making sure it never happens again. Your mother's death has to mean something, and the best way to honor her memory is to protect other families from experiencing what yours went through." The Foundation's work had revealed the staggering scope of military medical experimentation over the past 70 years. Project Regeneration had been only one of dozens of classified programs involving everything from psychoactive drugs to experimental surgical procedures to radiation exposure studies. Thousands of military personnel and their families had been affected by programs they never knew existed, suffering symptoms and conditions that were finally being understood in the context of deliberate human experimentation. Father O'Connor had become an unofficial chaplain for the Foundation, providing spiritual counseling for families struggling to reconcile their faith with the revelation that their government had treated their loved ones as test subjects. His own faith had been tested by the Henderson family's tragedy, but he had emerged from his crisis with a deeper understanding of the difference between earthly institutions and divine love. His Sunday sermons often addressed themes of forgiveness and justice, challenging his congregation to work for systemic change while maintaining compassion for individual perpetrators. "God does not call us to accept injustice in the name of forgiveness," he had preached during a service that was attended by dozens of affected families. "We can forgive those who wronged us while still demanding accountability. We can show mercy while working to ensure that such wrongs are never repeated." Maggie Henderson's death was a tragedy, but her legacy is becoming a force for healing and truth. The scientific community had been profoundly impacted by the revelations about consciousness transfer technology. The neural scaffolding removed from Maggie's brain had been studied by researchers around the world, leading to breakthroughs in understanding how memory and identity are stored and transmitted within the nervous system. However, the ethical implications of this research had led to strict international agreements prohibiting any attempt to replicate or develop similar technology without extensive oversight and informed consent protocols. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the neurologist who had monitored Maggie during her surgery, had become a leading advocate for neuroethics reform. Her research into the consciousness preservation effects observed in Project Regeneration subjects had contributed to new understanding of how trauma and memory are processed by the brain. But she had also been instrumental in establishing guidelines that would prevent future abuse of neuroscience research. What we learned from Maggie Henderson's case has advanced our understanding of human consciousness by decades, Dr. Martinez explained during a Foundation symposium. But we must never forget that this knowledge was gained through the suffering of innocent people. Our obligation as scientists is to use this knowledge responsibly and to ensure that human dignity is never again sacrificed for the advancement of research. The Henderson family's story had also had a profound impact on public understanding of military service and veterans' issues. The revelation that soldiers had been used as unwitting test subjects had led to increased support for veterans' health care and mental health services, as well as greater scrutiny of military medical practices. Veterans advocacy groups had embraced the Henderson Foundation's work, recognizing that the fight for accountability in historical experimentation was connected to broader issues of military transparency and veteran welfare. Tommy had spoken at several veterans events, sharing his perspective as a third-generation victim of military experimentation. His youth and articulate presentation style had made him an effective advocate for younger audiences who might not otherwise engage with veterans' issues. "My grandfather served his country with honor," Tommy had told a packed auditorium at a veterans conference. He volunteered for dangerous medical treatment because he believed it would help him survive and come home to his family. The fact that his service was exploited by people who saw him as a test subject rather than a human being is a betrayal of everything our military is supposed to represent. Emma had channeled her grief and anger into writing, contributing articles to the Foundation's newsletter and maintaining a blog that had become a popular resource for young people trying to understand the intersection of science, ethics, and government accountability. Her writing combined the emotional impact of personal experience with the analytical skills she had inherited from her grandmother's teaching background. Growing up, I thought my grandparents had the perfect love story, Emma had written in one widely shared blog post. They met young, married for love, and stayed devoted to each other through decades of ordinary life. But now I know their love story was extraordinary because it survived something that was designed to destroy human connection. The technology that killed my grandmother was meant to turn people into biological computers, but their love proved stronger than any technology. As the second anniversary of Maggie's death approached, the Henderson family was preparing for what would become an annual memorial service and advocacy conference. Families from across the country would gather in Millbrook to share their stories, support each other's healing, and continue the work of holding institutions accountable for their treatment of military personnel and their families. Jenny stood in her mother's rose garden, now expanded to include memorial plantings for other victims of military experimentation. The metallic roses from Maggie's funeral had been joined by traditional flowers donated by supporter families, creating a living monument to love's triumph over institutional cruelty. The garden bloomed each spring with renewed beauty, a testament to the possibility of growth and healing even in the aftermath of profound loss. "We've come a long way, Mom," Jenny said quietly, addressing the headstone that bore both her parents' names. "The truth is finally out, and we're making sure it can never be buried again. Tommy's going to study medicine, Emma's going to be a writer, and I'm going to keep fighting until every affected family gets the justice you never lived to see." The Henderson Foundation had grown beyond anything Jenny could have imagined when she first discovered her father's letters. What had started as a family's quest for answers had become a movement for accountability, transparency, and human dignity in medical research. The tragedy that had befallen Maggie and Bobby Henderson had catalyzed changes that would protect countless other families from similar suffering. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting golden light across the memorial garden, Jenny felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since her mother's death. The work was far from over, and the healing would continue for generations. But the silence that had protected institutional cruelty for 60 years had finally been broken. In death, Maggie Henderson had achieved something that had eluded her in life: the assurance that her family's suffering would serve a greater purpose and that love, truth, and justice would ultimately prevail over secrecy and abuse of power. The Henderson family's story had become a beacon of hope for other families struggling with the consequences of government betrayal, proving that ordinary people with extraordinary determination could hold the most powerful institutions accountable for their actions. Maggie Henderson's death had been a tragedy, but her legacy was becoming a force for healing that would benefit generations of military families yet to come. The autumn leaves drifted across Millbrook Cemetery as Jenny Henderson Walsh knelt beside her parents' shared headstone 5 years after the tragedy that had changed everything. The inscription read simply, "Robert and Margaret Henderson, together in love, united in truth." The metallic roses from Maggie's funeral had been preserved and incorporated into a permanent memorial, their artificial beauty now weathered but still catching the light in ways that reminded visitors of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought the family's story to national attention. Tommy, now 23 and completing his medical residency at Northwestern Memorial, stood beside his mother with his arm around his younger sister Emma, who had just graduated from Northwestern University with degrees in journalism and bioethics. The young woman who had once been a frightened teenager watching her grandmother suffer had become one of the most respected voices in medical ethics reform, her writing reaching audiences far beyond the advocacy community her family had helped to create. "I still dream about her sometimes," Emma said softly, placing a fresh bouquet of pink roses on the grave. "She's always in the kitchen, making Sunday dinner, and she looks exactly like she did when I was little. In the dreams, none of this ever happened. Dad never went to war, Grandpa never got hurt, and Grandma just grows old naturally, surrounded by great-grandchildren who adore her stories." Jenny smiled through tears that had become easier to shed over the years. The sharp edge of grief had softened into something more manageable, a quiet sadness that colored happy moments without destroying them. The family had learned to live with loss while building something meaningful from the ashes of their tragedy. The Henderson Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, now operating offices in 12 states and providing services to over 3,000 families affected by classified military medical experiments. The organization had helped secure over $200 million in compensation for victims and their survivors, funded groundbreaking research into the long-term effects of experimental treatments, and successfully lobbied for legislation that would prevent similar abuses in the future. Dr. Chen approached the family group carrying a wreath from the medical team that had tried to save Maggie's life. Now, in his early 60s, the neurosurgeon had become one of the Foundation's most dedicated supporters, donating both his time and expertise to help other families navigate complex medical situations related to historical experimentation. His collaboration with the Henderson family had led to the development of new surgical techniques that had saved dozens of lives. "She would be so proud of what you've accomplished," Dr. Chen said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine friendship that had developed over years of shared commitment to their cause. "The medical protocols we developed from her case have helped so many other families. Every life we save carries a little bit of her legacy forward." Father O'Connor arrived with a small group of parishioners who had known Maggie during her teaching years, their faces lined with age but bright with the kind of affection that transcends death. The priest, now in his 70s, had officiated at dozens of memorial services for Project Regeneration victims, helping families find meaning in senseless loss while working to ensure that the truth about government experimentation would never again be buried. "Maggie taught my daughter to read," said Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 80s whose granddaughter now worked for the Henderson Foundation. "She had a gift for making every child feel special, for seeing potential that others missed. That same gift is what made her family strong enough to turn their tragedy into a force for good." The memorial service that followed was attended by over 500 people, including veterans, family members of other victims, medical professionals, and government officials who had worked to implement the reforms that bore Maggie's name. The Henderson Act had become a model for medical ethics legislation around the world, and the annual memorial service had evolved into an international conference on human rights in medical research. Tommy delivered the keynote address, his voice strong and clear as he spoke about the intersection of medicine, ethics, and family loyalty. His work as a physician had been shaped by his grandparents' experience, driving him to specialize in neurology with a focus on treating patients who had been affected by experimental medical procedures. His research into consciousness and memory had built upon the scientific understanding gained from his grandmother's case, but always with an emphasis on human dignity and informed consent. My grandparents' love story began with a young soldier's decision to accept experimental treatment so he could survive and come home to the woman he loved, Tommy told the assembled crowd. It ended with that same woman's death 60 years later, killed by technology that was never supposed to affect her. But their love story didn't really end. It transformed into something larger, a commitment to truth and justice that has outlived both of them. Emma spoke next, her presentation focusing on the importance of family narratives in understanding historical trauma. Her doctoral dissertation on the intersection of memory, technology, and human identity had drawn heavily on her family's experience, contributing to academic understanding of how technological intervention affects not just individual patients, but entire family systems across generations. We tell our family's story not because we want sympathy, but because we believe that truth has the power to heal, Emma said. Every family affected by these experiments has a story worth telling, and every story contributes to our collective understanding of what went wrong and how we can prevent it from happening again. The afternoon session included presentations from researchers who had studied the neural scaffolding technology, medical ethicists who had worked to establish new protocols for experimental treatment, and legal experts who had helped secure compensation for affected families. The scientific understanding of consciousness transfer and memory preservation had advanced significantly since Maggie's death, but always within ethical frameworks designed to prevent future abuse. Colonel Hayes, now in her 80s but still sharp and committed to accountability work, delivered a presentation on the importance of institutional transparency in medical research. Her decision to reveal classified information about Project Regeneration had cost her military pension and subjected her to years of legal challenges, but she had never expressed regret about her choice to prioritize truth over institutional loyalty. I spent my career serving institutions that I believed represented the best of American values, Colonel Hayes told the audience. When I learned that those same institutions had betrayed the trust of the people they were supposed to protect, I had to choose between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to the principles it was supposed to represent. The Henderson family helped me understand that real patriotism sometimes requires holding our institutions accountable for their failures. As the formal presentations concluded, families began sharing their own stories in smaller groups, continuing conversations that had begun years earlier and would continue long after the conference ended. Children who had been born after their grandparents' deaths learned about relatives they had never met, while elderly veterans found community with others who had experienced similar betrayals of trust. Jenny moved through the crowd, greeting families she had come to know over years of advocacy work and welcoming newcomers who were just beginning to understand their own connections to historical experimentation programs. The work had become her life's mission, but it had also become a source of unexpected joy as she witnessed families finding healing through community and shared purpose. Dr. Williams, now retired from her family practice but still volunteering with the Foundation's Medical Advisory Board, approached Jenny during a quiet moment between presentations. The physician who had first recognized the seriousness of Maggie's condition had become like family to the Hendersons, her steady presence providing continuity through years of legal battles and advocacy work. "Your mother would have loved seeing all these families coming together," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had known Maggie not just as a patient, but as a friend. She always believed that education and community could solve any problem. This conference is exactly the kind of thing she would have organized if she had lived to see the truth come out. As the day drew to a close, the Henderson family returned to the cemetery for a private moment of reflection. The sun was setting over Millbrook, casting golden light across the headstones and memorial gardens that had become sacred space for hundreds of families affected by government experimentation. The metallic roses caught the light one last time, their artificial beauty serving as a reminder that love and technology could coexist when guided by wisdom and ethics. "I used to be angry that Grandma died for something that happened before I was born," Emma said as they stood together in the gathering darkness. "But now I understand that her death wasn't meaningless. It was the catalyst that brought all this truth to light. Without her sacrifice, thousands of other families would still be suffering in silence, not understanding what had been done to them." Tommy nodded, his medical training helping him appreciate the scientific advances that had resulted from their family's tragedy while never losing sight of the human cost. "The protocols we developed from her case have saved lives, but more importantly, they've restored dignity to the process of medical treatment. No one will ever again be subjected to experimental procedures without fully understanding what they're agreeing to." Jenny felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for years. The work would continue. There were still families to help, still research to conduct, still institutions to hold accountable. But the foundation they had built was strong enough to continue without her constant oversight. Tommy and Emma were ready to take leadership roles in the organization, ensuring that their grandparents' legacy would continue into the next generation. "They're together now," Jenny said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "And they know that their love story became something bigger than either of them could have imagined. They know that their sacrifice led to changes that will protect countless other families. They know that love really can triumph over institutional cruelty when people are willing to stand up for truth." The Henderson family walked home through the streets of Millbrook as darkness settled over the small town that had become the center of a national movement for medical ethics reform. The house where Maggie had raised her family and Bobby had recovered from his wartime service was now a beacon of hope for families across the country, proving that ordinary people with extraordinary determination could change the world. Inside the house, the walls were covered with photographs and letters from families who had found healing through the Foundation's work. Children who had been born free from the burden of hidden experimental effects. Veterans who had received proper treatment for conditions related to classified programs. And researchers who were developing new treatments within ethical frameworks that prioritized human dignity above scientific advancement. As they sat around the kitchen table where 3 generations of the family had shared meals and stories, Jenny, Tommy, and Emma felt the presence of the people who had shaped their lives and values. Maggie and Bobby Henderson were gone, but their influence lived on in every family helped by the Foundation, every reform implemented in their names, and every researcher who approached their work with the understanding that science serves humanity, not the other way around. The metallic roses from Maggie's funeral had been joined by thousands of natural flowers over the years, creating a living monument to the possibility of growth and beauty emerging from tragedy. The Henderson family's story had become a testament to the power of love, truth, and community to overcome even the most powerful forces of secrecy and institutional abuse. In the years to come, Tommy would revolutionize neurosurgical techniques while maintaining his commitment to patient advocacy and informed consent. Emma would become a leading voice in medical journalism, using her platform to ensure that stories like her family's would never again be buried by institutional secrecy. Jenny would continue leading the Foundation while gradually transitioning leadership to the next generation, secure in the knowledge that their work would continue long after she was gone. The Henderson family had learned that love stories don't end with death. They transform into legacies that touch countless other lives. Maggie and Bobby Henderson's love had transcended technology, government secrecy, and even death itself, becoming a force for healing that would benefit generations of families yet to come. Their tragedy had become triumph. Their loss had become hope. and their memory had become a beacon of light for everyone who believed that truth and justice could prevail over even the most powerful forces of darkness. As the clock struck midnight, marking another anniversary of Maggie's death, the Henderson family felt not grief, but gratitude for the time they had shared with an extraordinary woman, for the strength they had found in each other, and for the opportunity to transform their pain into purpose. The love that had sustained Bobby and Maggie through 60 years of marriage had become the foundation for a movement that would protect and heal families for generations to come. To our readers aged 55 to 68. The Henderson family's journey from devastating loss to meaningful purpose shows us that our deepest pain can become our greatest strength. Like Bobby and Maggie, you've lived through decades of change, witnessed institutional failures, and experienced losses that seemed insurmountable. Yet here you are, still fighting, still loving, still believing that tomorrow can be better than today. Your wisdom, your persistence, and your refusal to accept injustice are the forces that change the world. Every gray hair represents a battle survived. Every line on your face tells a story of resilience, and every day you choose hope over despair. You honor the memory of those who came before and light the way for those who follow. What moments in your own life have transformed pain into purpose? How has your generation's commitment to truth and justice shaped the world your children and grandchildren will inherit? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter, your voice has power, and your legacy is still being written.